Chapter 31. Shelling. Suddenly, Zhou Zishu felt a gaze on him. Someone seemed to stare at him specifically, then turned his head, and just hit Yi Baiyi's sight. Yi Baiyi was also standing in the crowd, not far from him. There was nothing to say. He didn't even nod his greetings. He still looked at him without blinking, and his expression was calm, like saying to Zhou Zishu, it's the same as when you're going to die. You're dying, and you've been a turtle with a shell all your life, Zhou Zishu said silently in his heart, and he thought, what's the big deal? I've come to this field, and gave it forward. What paves the way, and what is the plan? If a person has never been impetuous in his life, isn't he too depressed and sad? Suddenly, he realized that in fact, his wish was only to be a king of 8 without a shell. The clamoring crowd suddenly heard a chuckle, and his laughter supposedly shouldn't be highlighted in the noisy crowd, but I don't know what method the man used, and everyone's voice was suppressed by birth. Then, a man with a yellow face and a shameless appearance came out and whispered, "You, everyone in the court, embarrassed a child. What is the truth?" Zhang Chengling opened his eyes, opened his mouth, and silently called master. Cao Weining recommended Gao Chong for Zhou Zishu, so Gao Chong paused and called out his identity, Brother Zhou. Gao Chong only felt very strange. At this moment, the man was wearing a peculiar style of masters. It stands to reason that he should definitely not forget to look at it. However, when Cao Weining brought them to Gao Jia Zhuang that day, he did not notice at this point. Even until then, he could barely remember his surname Zhou, but he couldn't remember his name. Gao Chong's heart was a little surprised. I saw Zhou Zishu beckoning to Zhang Chengling and said, "Little ghost, come here." Zhang Chengling immediately rushed into his arms without saying a word, just like seeing his dad. Feng Xiaofeng said sharply, "Who are you?" Zhou Zi embraced Zhang Chengling's shoulders, tilted his head and looked at Feng Xiaofeng, and when he saw him, he felt very upset, so he provoked slowly, "Don't you even recognize your father?" Feng Xiaofeng was furious, and this time he did not wait for him to speak. He shouted at Zhou Zishu with a roar, and his body was very huge. Every step on the ground seemed to affect the ground and shock him. Similarly, then the mountain shouting tsunami rushed over, and with a meteor hammer as big as a human head in his hand, he had to hammer Zhou Zishu into a meat sauce. He seemed to treat everyone who dared to insult Feng Xiaofeng as if he killed his father and his enemies, and the relationship between the two was really weird. Zhou Zishu's figure flickered but was no longer in place. By the way, Zhang Chengling was taken away, and the meteor hammer hit the ground, which actually knocked the bluestone slab out of a large pit. Gao Chonglian looked on, and thought that this person's light work seemed to have reached the point where he could be absorbed into the world, and he could still have such a speed while holding a person. When the mountain slave missed it, he lifted his hand and swept out with another hammer, humming. Zhou Zishu saw the timing, and his toe was slightly on the chain, and he pulled up 2 feet high, and then made a kick on the hammer by the direction of the meteor hammer, and I didn't know how big his foot was. Anyway, when people reacted, the meteor hammer had already made a circle and rushed towards their master. Alpine slaves are not very flexible, they are unavoidable. In anxiety, he had to hold his body tightly, withdraw his head, lean to the side, yelled, and slammed it with his shoulder. He flew out and fell to the ground. Feng Xiaofeng screamed, as if the meteor hammer was hitting himself. At this moment, he couldn't even care about others, so he flew up to see his Alpine slave first. Alpine slave's shoulder was shattered to one side, but after all, he was thicker and thicker than others, alive and conscious, and curled up into a huge pile on the ground. Without speaking, his eyes looked so painfully Feng Xiaofeng. Feng Xiaofeng then looked up, and cast his eyes fiercely on Zhou Zishu. Zhou Zishu faced Shen Shui, and said, "He wants my life, but I don't want his life." Then he pulled Zhang Chengling and said, "Let's go." "Stop." This time it was Hua Shan who was in charge of Chuling. As soon as he stood up, several major martial arts behind Hua Shan faction followed him. Yu Chu looked at Zhou Zishu very poorly, and then hugged rashly, holding his fist and gritting his teeth. He said, "This night, you just took this child away from the heroes in the world, but you didn't look at the big guy too?" Zhou Zishu glanced at him, and asked lightly, "What about you said?" Yu Chu said, "If you can go, you can tell him why he was chased by him 3 or 2 times. Does the Zhang family have anything to do with Liu Lijia? Who is Liu Lijia now?" Zhou Zishu smiled, glanced at the head of this bitter and hostile Hua Shan, lowered his head, and asked Zhang Chengling, "Do you know what he is talking about?" Zhang Chengling tightened his lips and shook his head. Zhou Zishu asked again, "What did he want to say if he asked you?" Zhang Chengling reached out his hand and carefully held his clothes without saying a word. Zhou Zishu nodded, and then turned back to Qiu Yun and said, "You head, you can ask if you don't have to answer. We'll just leave it there and it will be good in the future." Yan Yan pulled Zhang Chengling to raise his leg and walked away. The zodiac leader of Kang Shan behind Yu Chu sneered and said, "No one in the eyes of a kid. This zodiac is very unreliable. He has a black egg face, which is as crooked as possible, and he prefers to follow the old fan Yu Chu who is holding a folding fan all the year round. He does not know what he thinks." At this moment, he was dissatisfied, like a huge potato bouncing. Zhou Zishu laughed secretly, saying that no one in his eyes was right. Anyway, these hen-like goods can only be whispered, none of them can be seen. Seeing that the zodiac was delivered, Zhou Zishu Zhang Ling the hands never let go. The crowd only felt a flower in front of them, and the two of them did not know how many moves they took. Then the zombies groaned and took 3 steps backwards, spitting a spit of blood. Then he sat on the ground with one butt, into a baked potato. Immediately under the court, "Master! Head!" exclaimed. Yu Chu, anxious, pointed at Zhou Zi and said, "Where did the demons come from? Are they with the group of evil spirits? Don't let him go. If you can't hit it, you will buckle up a big hat." Zhou Zi shouted and twitched Zhang Chengling. He didn't intend to entangle with them, and it was a few feet away in a blink of an eye. There was chaos in the field, with Cao Weining stubbornly defending him, those who were sublime and impassioned, such as the sublime Zhao Jing, and others who were choked by a group of rice barrels headed by Qiu Yu and followed the incident for unknown reasons. Yelling, "It's like a dog market." Zhou Zishu walked through the crowd like a ghost, and occasionally shot a few to hit him. Zhang Chengling in his arms, because of the relationship between Mujia, has become a piece of flesh and bones that everyone wants to take a sip. Yu Kuaiyu suddenly turns into a mad dog, chasing after him. Zhou Zishu only felt that the head of Hua Shan was like an old woman, and it was not over. Then my heart burst into flames, paused, and turned around, intending to touch him. At this moment, suddenly a whiplash burst into the air, just intercepting the way of Qiu Yun, and then a rush of wine rushed towards the face. Zhou Zishu took a closer look. The man in a messy clothes was actually last night Wen K. Sing, who left without saying a word of greeting. I saw Wen K. Sing's eyes were red, and his steps were cluttered with drunkards. He smiled at Zhou Zishu very arrogantly, and planned to look back at Bei Mei Sheng, but was destroyed by a wine drinker. He said, "A Shu, you go first, I will stop you, they." Before he said this, the man was stunned. It looked like a tumbler in the wind, shaking his head and tail, and it was frightening to look at it. However, he turned to Yu Chu to greet him. All of them hid. In the left and right shaking, his whip was thrown in a random way, and he didn't know what happened, so just right, he got entangled in Chu Ling's calf, and in front of the eyes, he tripped the head of Hua Shan. Wen K. Sing also rubbed his eyes vigorously, while stepping on the yang steps like the noodles with soft legs. He tilted his head and looked at the shameful and indignant Yu Chu, shaking his hands in front of his eyes and saying with a big tongue, "That, 2 or 2 heads, you drink too much? What do you do on the ground?" Zhou Zishu glanced at him, shaking his head in his heart, feeling that this time the Hua Shan faction was going to wear out with Wen K. crossing. He led Wen K. Sing to this situation without delay. He picked up Zhang Chengling and took it away. He didn't know where to get the 2 horses. He threw Zhang Chengling on the horse and took him away. Zhang Chengling couldn't ride, he just couldn't do anything. He didn't go far enough, but he couldn't catch up with Zhou Zishu, and dangled on horseback. Zhou Zishu sighed in his heart, knowing that he was a rotten tree. He did not ask him as a beam, and abandoned the horse after running for a while, and led Zhang Chengling into a deserted yard that had been inhabited for a long time. After a long day, the teenager took a rest. After a while, the gate of the courtyard was suddenly pushed open from the outside. Zhang Chengling immediately jumped up all around, but saw that Wen K. Sing walked in step by step. At first Zhang Chengling thought he was pretending to be drunk. However, at this moment, he found that he was almost indistinguishable from north to south, and walked a few steps like a headless fly. Flick forward and fall down. Zhou Zishu quickly lifted his face and saw that Wen K. Sing was ruddy and showed no signs of injury at all. He also smirked at him. He held Zhou Zishu's legs tightly with his 2 arms and rolled them aside. Lying on the ground, I wonder whether he used his legs as a pillow or a quilt. Zhou Zishu couldn't help but asked, "Did you fall into the wine jar?" Wen K. Sing said with a big tongue, "I found a wine cellar yesterday. Well, I spent a night in it and drank a dozen altars. Happy. He really drank too much. When he laughed, he couldn't stop. He hugged Zhou Zishu's legs and buried his face in his mouth. Zhou Zishu watched his head tilted aside without words, and Tian woke up and fell asleep day by day, so he concluded that the man was full. Chapter 32. Rong Xuan. Thus the three of them casually clapped their asses and beat it. Meanwhile, the Gao's manor was a ball of chaos. Cao Wei-ning was still indignantly informing those beside him that the Hua Shan sect was clearly being unkind in this matter when Mo Wai-kong dragged him away and gave him a brief command. "Shut up." Cao Wei-ning turned to look at his Shishu. Just as he wanted to ask Shishu, "How could you yield to evil forces?" he saw Mo Wai-kong point at Yu Kuaiyufeng. "Didn't you see him go looking for death? Shut up, turn off the bullshit, and take a good look." Cao Wei-ning obediently shut up. He took a moment to glance all around, then lowered his voice. "Shishu, you said that with warriors Gao and Zhao here, how could brother Zhou take away the Zhang's child so easily?" Mo Wai-kong's eagle eyes had been trained ahead, but at hearing that, they coldly swept over to Cao Wei-ning. "Did your brain get eaten by a dog?" he squeezed out through his teeth. Cao Wei-ning had been harshly scolded by him for so long, yet his face didn't display any redness, very sincerely waiting for his Shishu to clear up his doubts. Against expectations, Mo Wai-kong turned his face away and didn't pay him any more mind. It took Cao Wei-ning a short moment to suss out why, making the discovery that his brain really had been eaten for him to not even realize such a thing. His Shishu also clearly had no idea. Grandmaster Simu quickly rushed over, a middle-aged man following behind him. The man was of gaunt stature with black clothes and deep laugh lines, the corners of his mouth cast downward, his sword-like brows shooting into the hairs on his temples and his eyes extremely clear. One look told that he was a master not to be trifled with. Upon witnessing this farcical scene, Grandmaster Simu had no choice but to use the Shaolin's lion roar skill to make a loud bellow. Many of meager martial arts saw black before their eyes at his call, the crowd then settling down. Gao Chong and Zhao Jing saw the man behind Grandmaster Simu and both stood up, Zhao Jing taking the initiative to unveil his identity. "Brother Shen." Cao Wei-ning heard Mo Wai-kong gasp in surprise, quickly taking the opportunity to question him. "Who is this, Shishu?" Mo Wai-kong's brows furrowed. "That's the head of the Shuzhong Shen family, Shen Shen. He's normally a big young madam type and never steps foot out of his residence, getting a white face from being shut up in his house for fear that he'd get tan. Why would he be willing to part with all that soft skin to run a good distance over and see the sun in Dongting? Very strange." Cao Wei-ning had never heard of him, so he just made a dumb-sounding ah. Mo Wai-kong hated seeing that stupid look of his the most, so he sent him a glare and gave an explanation. "Most people your age don't know this. Back in the day, the 5 most famed major families of Zhonghu were Jiangnan's Zhong, Taihu's Zhao, Dongting's Gao, Shuzhong Shen, and Taixing's Lu. Nowadays, though, apart from Gao Chong and Zhao Jing, the Zhong family has one member left. The Shen family has long since washed their hands of Zhonghu's affairs and ignored them, and the Lu family is gone. The 5 great clans have been more name than fact for a while now, and lots of young folk already don't remember them." Cao Wei-ning counted them on his fingers. "Something's wrong, Shishu. Counting the Zhong's descendant, that's only 4 surnames here. Where's the 5th family?" "That's because the head of the Lu family has been dead of illness for a decade now," Mo Wai-kong replied impatiently. "He didn't accumulate enough merit in his last life, so in this one, his family line was cut off, and he left behind no sons or daughters. Because he'd had something of a friendship with Tai Shan sect leader Hua Fangling, who since turned into a stiff, he entrusted his family property and few young disciples to the Tai Shan sect. Hua Qingsong and the rest are here now, so don't they count as the Lu family? Why don't you understand shit? Where are so many questions coming from? Don't go telling others I'm your Shishu. You're a disgrace." Shen Shen was witnessed saying something in a low voice to Grandmaster Simu, who then sighed, spoke the Buddha's name, and nodded. Soon after, Shen Shen stood up, turned to take a box held by a junior of the Shen family, and opened it. Within was a small bundle wrapped in silk, which Shen Shen peeled open. Someone sucked in a breath, automatically crying out, "It's the Lapis armor." Cao Wei-ning also stretched out his neck to take a look, sighting the completely exposed object in the case. It was indeed an extremely delicate fragment of colored glass only about the size of a palm, glinting feebly under the daylight. Were it not said to be so, who would have known that it was exactly this little trinket that incited such great carnage? Yu Kuaiyufeng gulped, then cleared his throat. "Is this really one of the 5 pieces of lapis armor?" he muttered. That is the truth, Shen Shen replied, turning his gaze to Gao Chong after he finished speaking. It was unclear what the expression on Gao Chong's face was, and it was only after a long moment of silence that he spoke to Deng Quan at his side. On the shelf to the left of the door in my study, behind the third tome of the Classic of Rites, there's a hidden compartment. Open it and fetch the contents for me. Deng Quan accepted the order, not understanding the reason for this. He returned a moment later, a small box having come into his possession. Gao Chong took it, sighed, then opened it up for the crowd, placed side by side with Shen Shen's small case. 2 pieces of the Lapis armor from legend thus made a public appearance. As things have gotten to this point, this aging old man has to make things clear to you all, Gao Chong announced. The Lapis armor really does have 5 pieces altogether, and each of us 5 was holding one all these years. Brother Lu met his early death a few years back, thus delivering his piece to warrior Hua, sect leader of Taishan. Unexpectedly, though, that would actually attract the calamity of death upon him. Grandmaster Simu grabbed onto the subject. Amitabha. This old monk also knows a little bit about that incident. Everyone's eyes turned to this kind-looking, entirely white-haired senior Shaolin monk. I'm unsure if anyone present here still remembers that martial circle catastrophe of 30 years ago, they all heard him say. As soon as that statement came out, the looks on some of the older generation's faces immediately underwent change. Even Yi Bai, who had seemed to be spectating the occasion on the side all this time, lifted his head up slightly. At the same time, Zhou Zishu was also going along with his memory as he told the completely fog-covered Zhang Chengling of the Zhang family's past. When Kei Sing was passed out at the side, having been kicked away by Zhou Zishu yet still tightly gripping his sleeve with no letting go, lying there sprawled out on his back and utterly unpresentable. At the time Zhou Zishu had been dragged out by Cao Weining in the morning, he had just been about to eat a little something, though he hadn't the time to in the end and had no choice but to bundle it up and put it away. He took it out for Zhang Chengling in this interim, watching the boy hark it down all at once. I only have general knowledge of what happened 30 years ago. It was around the time your father was still young. There was a martial genius in Jianghu named Rong Xuan. He was a hero that wielded a longsword, rarely met a worthy opponent within the 4 seas, and was fond of wandering around and making friends from all sides, reportedly having very confidential dealings with the younger generations of all 5 great clans back in the day. The 5 great clans are no longer brought up nowadays, but as a descendant of the Zhang family, you've always known of them, right? Zhang Chengling nodded, bits of snacks still around his mouth. But Dad never mentioned him. It wasn't just your dad that didn't, his name has been taboo for the past 30 years. Zhou Zishu sighed before continuing on. Rong Xuan got married later on. His wife was a young lady far above the norm and very pretty, who came from the Divine Medicine Valley. His speech suddenly stopped at that point. He bowed his head to glance at Wen Kei Sing, thinking to himself, he was also born of the Divine Medicine Valley. Was this a coincidence, too? When he raised his head, Zhang Chengling was in the middle of staring at him unblinkingly following his pause. Zhou Zishu had some doubts within, but was not going to reveal them in front of him. The two were in deep spousal love, he continued on, Dao companions for life. However, unexpectedly, there would come a day that Rong Xuan's wife was murdered. Zhang Chengling froze, then asked a silly question. Why? Zhou Zishu grinned. Was a justification needed to kill someone? He thought it over before he explained. Most likely. An average man is guiltless, but being talented is a crime. I never saw Rong Xuan's swordsmanship, only hearing that the words unprecedented and unreplaceable were truly loathed. He hadn't yet reached 30 when he made up his own sect, creating the renowned Feng Shan sword. Not being able to witness the mountain splitting, sea dividing Feng Shan swordplay in this lifetime is a huge regret. His Feng Shan sword was split into 2 volumes, the first was a martial core method, and the second was a sword technique. The latter was his own creation, while the former was said to be an ancient book passed down in secret that he happened to obtain, that which affected and weaved the heart. You should know. The words a peerless master alone could make someone go mad. What happened after? Zhang Chengling asked. After, Rong Xuan's immense grief was enough to put him into a qi deviation. His nature changed greatly, and he began to slaughter innocents at will. With no other option, the 5 great clans took the lead, even requesting aid of Shan Healing, wanting to join forces to hunt him down, even though the last time Shan Healing had been in worldly affairs was about 30 or more years. Then, Rong Xuan fled to Qingju Ridge of Fengya Mountain, and there, with the people hunting him that were headed by the 5 great clans, a fierce battle broke out. It was unknown how many died, and purportedly, The dead can still be heard to weep there at night. Who would have ever expected that they'd be crossing forces with someone they had been through thick and thin with in the past, not stopping until annihilation? Was affection in this world truly so fickle? He paused for a moment, nodding. That's right. Qingju Ridge is Ghost Valley. No one can understand to this day why the ghost stood by Rong Xuan's side back then. It's unknown how many days and nights the battle took, but it ended with Rong Xuan's suicide. Over half of the realm's heroes had been impaired, and the 5 great clans also took a stumble they would henceforth never recover from. As both sides sustained great losses that time, it was only after its conclusion that the Ghost Valley made the rule that those that entered couldn't leave, buying 30 years of peace. Having spoken up to that point, Zhou Zishu frowned. He'd merely heard of this tale and hadn't added in his own conjecture, but talking like this left many areas of unknowns. What happened at Fengyi Mountain then, for example? How did Rong Xuan's wife die? How did a such prodigy that should have been the master of a generation fall into the Ghost Valley, keeping company with its people? Thankfully, Zhang Chengling was not an astute child, merely listening on in ignorance and not having epiphanies at all. The details of this, buried for so many years. How many could be brought to light? Those who participated had either died or kept their lips sealed. Even all of Tian Chuang couldn't gather together the truth. Zhou Zishu had a suspicion that the Lapis armor was a relic of the day of the battle on Fengyi Mountain. In the evening, Zhou Zishu finally managed to pry open Wen Keising's hand that was tugging firmly at his clothes. He shot a few wild animals and brought them back, roasting them for eating. He mulled over how no matter where he went, bringing such a little thing along was cumbersome. But he didn't want to force him, only letting Zhang Chengling think of what path he should take himself. Wen Keising was so very drunk that the day had darkened and he was still not getting up from his mud-like paralysis. Zhou Zishu taught Zhang Chengling a few mnemonics, told him to catch onto them himself, then leaned to the side and closed his eyes to rest, falling into a dazed sleep an unclear amount of time later. He then suddenly sensed a single hand feeling about his body, very sneakily trying to undo the buttons on his upper clothes. Zhou Zishu grasped the person by the wrist, opening his eyes. Wen Keising was still a bit drunk at the moment. He didn't panic upon noticing that he'd been caught, simply smiling towards him in the darkness and then justifying himself. I only wanted to see what the fabled 7 aperture nails look like, not to grab you in whatever way or deliberately act like a felon. The phrase went, explaining is just concealment. Concealment is just the beginning of a mistake, and this vulgar when man had given one specific elaboration. He'd been grabbed by Zhou Zishu on one wrist, the other hand propped up against the ground, and he was nearly half stooping over Zhou Zishu's form. Zhang Chengling was already dead asleep at this time. They breathed and spoke very lightly, and in the dark, that had a sort of indescribable ambiguity. Wen Keising abruptly got closer, taking off his own outer robe and bundling the other in it, stirring up the hair on his temple as he spoke in a low voice. Ah Shu, is Zhou Shu really your name? Zhou Zishu flung the man's hand off and pushed him away. What kind of joke is that, brother Wen? As if Wen Keising is your real name, he said with bold confidence. Wen Keising raised his brow at that, replying with another, even lower and softer question. Then, according to your view, what should I be called? Zhou Zishu went quiet for a moment before he whispered back. Brother Wen, is your surname really Wen? I feel like you ought to be a wrong. Chapter 33. Ghostmaster. Slowly, Wen Keising righted himself into a sitting position, looking at him without saying a word. Crossing his legs, fingers tapping against his own knee, he only said in a quiet voice, and half a beat, my surname isn't wrong, I'm only bitter that I've never met that one surnamed wrong in my life, otherwise, I'll slaughter him once for every one time I run into him. Zhou Zishu's face was devoid of any surprise. Upon hearing this, he patsies, before his speech slowed as he said, oh? Looks like I've guessed wrongly, then, I thought that the current master of the Ghost Valley is a wrong family descendant. In the darkness, only Zhang Chengling's light snoring could be heard. The distance between the two of them was not far, but was as silent as a graveyard. After a while, a smile slowly formed on Wen Keising's face. This smile was different from his usual dumb, squinty-eyed grin. There were no laugh wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, his pitch-black irises still as cold as ice, reflecting a weak light. He looked over sharply. Slender eyebrow cocked slightly, giving off the impression of a false smile. Zhou Zishu's voice was so quiet that it seemed like his lips did not move at all, but the speed at which he spoke was rapid. The delighted morning ghost spent money to hire the poisonous scorpion to stalk the kid all throughout his journey, not because he wanted to kill him, but because he desperately wanted to know if he'd seen a man with a missing finger when the Zhang family tragedy had occurred. According to what I know, the hanged ghost, Shui Fang, is missing a finger. But ever since we met those people in the rundown temple that day, I knew that the extermination of the Zhang family was not carried out by someone of the Ghost Valley. Like he was greatly interested, Wen Kai-sing continued asking. How did you know this? Zhou Zishu toughed lightly. Escorting that kid to Taihu unharmed, with all his limbs intact out of the snare of 100,000 ghosts. If my abilities were really that great, I'd have rutted over the pugilist world years ago. What would be here for? Wen Kai-sing looked at him with a burning gaze, and said, you don't have to be this humble, either. Zhou Zishu continued, but why would the delighted morning ghost chase after this kid so doggedly? I think that there might be only one explanation. No matter who committed the deed on the Zhang family, there must have been a ghost from the Bamboo Ridge who left the valley on his own and got himself involved in this, and the delighted morning ghost suspects that, or should I say, wants to let people suspect that this person is the hanged ghost. Additionally, the man in black who Gu Xiang killed in the rundown temple the other day, said the word purple right before he died. Purple what? Let me guess. It can't be purple danger, can it? Wen Kai-sing nodded. Indeed, the two of us followed them from Jiangnan all the way to Taihu, and then to Dongting. We arrived coincidentally and our appearance was suspicious. I even killed that little ghost in the underground cave, because I was wary of him exposing my identity, am I right? Zhou Zishu said, this isn't difficult to guess, Brother Wen. If you take a look at the entire Jianghu, there are too few people who I can't guess the background of. Discounting those of the southern border and the northern desert, within the pugilist world of the Central Plains, I can count them on one hand. You and I have spent many days together. If I still couldn't tell, wouldn't I be too stupid? Wen Kai-sing was silent for a while, neither confirming nor denying. Then a laugh escaped him, and he nodded. You really know too many things. Manor Lord Zhou? Lord Zhou. Zhou Zishu smiled. I'm no more than a civilian now, the Valley Master is too polite. When Wen Kai-sing had directly named the 3 autumn nails of the 7 acupunctures earlier, Zhou Zishu had known that Wen Kai-sing had already guessed at his own background. The two of them ate nothing else in that moment. Wen Kai-sing was no longer the glib-tongued Casanova who had an exclusive taste for men, and Zhou Zishu was no longer the broke homeless wanderer who sang little tunes off-pitch. The mysterious master of Fengya Mountain and the unpredictable former leader of Tian Chuang faced each other silently in an abandoned house, but it was more like a soundless sizing up of the other. The only witness was, unbelievably, sleeping like the dead off to one side. Zhou Zishu glanced in the direction of Zhang Chengling, and lowered his voice even further. Isn't the Ghost Master following this child because you think he knows something such as, who the person who broke the rule and left the valley, and kept hunting him down after is? Wen Kai-sing asked in reply, all smiles, how do you know that the one I'm following is him? Zhou Zishu let loose a laugh. If you're not following him, you can't be following me, can you? Yet, Wen Kai-sing only smiled. His demeanor could have been easily mistaken for one deeply in love as they gazed at their lover, his smile giving Zhou Zishu goosebumps. Half a beat later, Wen Kai-sing asked, light, Shu, don't you think we're becoming a better match for each other? Zhou Zishu said, not at all. Wen Kai-sing gazed at him, his expression still one of hair-raising gentleness. They looked at each other for half a beat, before Zhou Zishu suddenly asked, are you crazy, or is this an after effect of a chi deviation? But Wen Kai-sing caught his fingers lightly and caressed his palm. He liked it, bent his head to press a gentle kiss to the back of his hand, and asked, what do you think? Goosebumps instantly rose all over on Zhou Zishu's body. He snatched his hand back. That warm sensation of his lips and that persistent gaze seemed to entangle into something inseparable. Zhou Zishu was starting to find that Wen Kai-sing was demented, and not lightly so. Wen's appetite is too good. Wen Kai-sing said shamelessly, nicely put, except that my appetite is whetted once I lay eyes on you. What do you suggest I do? Immediately afterwards, before Zhou Zishu could say anything, Wen Kai-sing continued bullshitting endlessly. Many years ago, I saw a corpse by the roadside which hair had already withered, the mess clumped into a ball. The colors of its clothes had faded until I can no longer tell what they once had been. It had a face that was gory with blood and flesh, its nose sliced off, its features indistinguishable. A spear had pierced it from the chest in front all through to its back, coming out from under the shoulder blades. I glanced at it a few more times. One look at those shoulder blades, and I knew that this had to be an unparalleled beauty when they had been alive, and guess what? Zhou Zishu inhaled deeply, but Wen Kai-sing interjected before he could speak, I have yet to misjudge a person's beauty, having told a person's beauty by their bones my whole life. So, Shu, you might as well wash off the disguise on your face, and let kiss and hug you until my addiction is sated. Beautiful people are rare in this world, but they're also not too difficult to come across. I've embraced almost all of the beauties in this world, and have never posted them afterwards. Who knows, perhaps after I've seen your true face, we develop passionate, torrid emotions for each other, have a one-night stand and I won't think of you afterwards again. But the way you are now makes me want to live out the rest of my life with you instead. Joe's issue had wanted to say something, his words already on the tip of his tongue, but instantly forgot them once he heard this. He stared at Wen Sing, eyes wide and tongue-tied. Then Wen Sing cackled, rocking back and forth in his laughter, and pointed at Joe's issue as he said, "Scared you to death, didn't I?" "Fuck you," Joe's issue evaluated simply, then paused. As though he had thought of something, he suddenly patted his shoulder, and said, "Forget it, my condolences." Wen Sing froze, and asked hesitantly, "What?" But Joe's issue said nothing else, only L can against the wall, and closed his eyes to rest. Why would someone remember a dead person's appearance so clearly that they could still relate what they had been wearing and how their hair had been in such extensive detail, even after so many years had passed? He must have gone over it countless times until it had been carved into his heart, narrated in a joking manner as if it was nothing to him, over and over again, only fearing that he would forget how the deceased had looked like. Inexplicably, Joe's issue understood that feeling they might have met in the ocean of strangers out of coincidence, ignorant of each other's background, but this did not stand in the way of them being kindred souls. The next day, Joe's issue left the abandoned courtyard with Zhang Chengling, of course, bringing an uninvited shadow with the surname or went along with them. Joe's issue was planning to pay another visit to the Ping'an Bank to check in on the progress of what he asked them to investigate the last time, so that he could gain a better understanding on things. It afforded him to stuff information into Zhang Chengling's empty head, and that he didn't just dumbly practice Guangong and do nothing else. Zhang Chengling discovered very quickly that learning from this cheap shifu of his was extremely painful. He only cared about reciting a whole bunch of tongue-twisting and complex mantras, uncaring of whether others could understand him or memorize them, and treated that as imparting knowledge to Zhang Chengling. To give this practice a better sounding name, it was a shifu's responsibility to accept disciples, and a person's own responsibility to cultivate knowledge. Zhang Chengling felt that Joe's issue's expectations were too high, higher than the halfway point up a mountain amid the fog and clouds. His head was even more muddled, his eyes rolling back in his head as he falteringly recited the mantras. Joe's issue was very annoyed by his dumb look, and unwetted him on the hack of his head, scolding, "Are you reciting formulas, or hanging yourself?" Zhang Chengling knew he was stupid, not daring to talk back. He gazed at him with a wronged expression, and so Joe's issue asked, "What?" Zhang Chengling said, "Shifu, I don't understand." Joe's issue inhaled deeply, feeling that since he had accepted Zhang Chengling calling him Shifu, logically, he should have some patience with him, and so he suppressed his temper, slowed his speech and asked with what he felt was great patience, "Which part of it do you not understand?" Zhang Chengling glanced at him, lowered his head silently, and mumbled, "All of it." Without a word, Joe's issue relocated his gaze to look somewhere else. He held it in for a long while, but finally could not hold it in any longer. "Kid, is that thing on top of your neck a head, or a chamber pot?" On the one side, Wen Sing was enjoying the show. Witnessing this situation, he went up to pull them apart, actively imagining himself to be the kind father beside a strict mother. Half pleased with himself and half smug, he told Joe's issue merrily, "That's enough. Do you know how to teach your disciple? Even the smartest disciple will tum-dum with how much you reprimand him." Joe's issue said, "Why would I not know how to? I single-handedly taught my shitty all he knew." Wen Sing's eyes widened slightly, and he asked, curious, "So what did you do when your shitty couldn't recite the mantras, or get the technique right?" This was quite some time ago. Joe's issue frowned as he tried to recall. Before he said, "I made him copy 300 times the rudimentary mantra for practicing Qi, that every new disciple accepted into our set has to learn. If he couldn't get it, he could practice at his own pace. If he still didn't get it, he didn't get to eat. And if he still did not reveal the slightest hint of emotion." Joe's issue patted Zhang Chengling's head not too gently, and said straightforwardly, "Learn it properly. If you want to survive for a few days more, you need to be capable." Then he threw Zhang Chengling to Wen Sing's care, said, "I'm going to see an old friend. Help me look after him for a bit," and left using Guangong without a single glance back, leaving Zhang Chengling and Wen Sing to look at each other incredulously. After half a beat, Wen Sing said, with deep feeling, "Your Shifu's words are extremely true. You need to be capable. Forget it, he's not here, let's swap brains." I'll continue with the second half of the tale of the red child I was telling you the previous time. Zhang Chengling was a good-for-nothing. He instantly brightened up, and the two of them headed towards the nearest tavern as he listened to Wen Kai-sing narrate. But what should he do with all those monsters? The red child thought for a very long time, tried many things until he really thought of an idea. He only needed a magical artifact. With one of them making things up as he went along, and the other an enthusiastic audience, the journey was extremely enjoyable. Just as they were about to enter a tavern, out of the blue, they heard a girl from behind them call, "Master, Master, I've finally found you." Wen Kai-sing and Zhang Chengling glanced back to see Gu Xiang skipping towards them. Oddly enough, following behind her was Cao Wei-ning. Wen Kai-sing could not come up with an explanation for these two had ended up together, but before he could even ask, Gu Xiang chattered on like beans spilling from a cup. "I couldn't find you yesterday, so I went to look for you and I heard this Cao de Ge say you and Zhou Shu brought that Zhang kid away, and he volunteered to take me out to look for you." Cao Wei-ning grinned dumbly, and repeated, "It's my pleasure, it's my pleasure." Gu Xiang continued, "Master, Cao de Ge isn't only righteous, he's also well educated, let me tell you." Wen Kai-sing wanted to pretend that he didn't know the two of them, and pulled Zhang Chengling into the tavern. Chapter 34. Demon Girl. When Zhou Zishu walked into the bank once more, it wasn't only the shopkeeper who came out to welcome him. Upon hearing of his arrival, a plump, fortunate-looking man strode out to welcome him. This man had thin brows, thin eyes, and a fleshy nose, his face like a fluffy white bun that had just been taken out of the steamer. It was a pleasing, affable face. Bowing slightly, the shopkeeper very respectfully followed 2 steps behind this man. Once he saw Zhou Zishu, he first froze for a moment, before adding probing, "Are you Lord Zhou?" Zhou Zishu smiled, saying, "Why, does Ping'an no longer recognize me?" This man who had come out to welcome him was Boss Song of the Ping'an Bank, Song Ping'an. Rumor had it that this man was originally the housekeeper of the Nanning Manor, who came out into the world to start a trading business with some of his savings after his master had passed. Not even a few years had passed, and his business was thriving. His ventures were everywhere across the country. He never stopped shuttling from one place to another, and no one knew where he would be. Many traders knew that this Boss Song was shrewd at business, but was a rare sort who was righteous and not cunning. Gradually, with great testimonies and ambition to spare, the Song business prospered. Extremely excited, he ordered the shopkeeper to close up shop, dismiss the assistants, clean the place, and invited Zhou Zishu to sit, saying, "This servant was originally near young Zhou, but I hurried over once I heard the news. Have my subordinates ever given my lord unsatisfactory service? My master has been missing you for a good few years." Right after, Ping'an lowered his voice. "Many thanks to Lord Zhou, for concealing the news about my master leaving the capital all those years ago, so we can have these few years of peace." Zhou Zishu took a sip of tea, smiling. "It's no trouble at all. Is 7th Lord faring well?" Yet he was thinking, trouble only stops when your master died. If he screams earlier, everyone can peacefully. Ping'an smiled. "He's very good, thank you, my lord, for keeping him in your thoughts." This servant sent a letter once he had received the news, and only just received the master's reply yesterday. He says that he's coming this way with the shaman, and can probably arrive in about 10 to 14 days. Hearing this, Zhou Zishu's calm face twitched immediately. He thought, the pugilist world of the Central Plains was in enough chaos, and this troublemaker still wanted to add to it. Truly a year of bad fortune. It was accumulating all sorts of natural disasters and human catastrophes. Yet, he was still courteous in speech as he said, "How could I possibly trouble 7th Lord and the shaman?" Ping'an said, "It's nothing. My master has been extremely free with nothing to do after taking up permanent residence at the southern border, and this is a perfect chance for him to get some exercise. Master has said that he still promised my lord all those years ago to find him a beautiful, slender-waisted Nanjiang lady to be his wife." Zhou Zishu broke out in a sweat, and said hastily, "Kid, I was just kidding." Yet, he inexplicably recalled the previous day in the abandoned courtyard, and the serious manner in which Wen Kai-sing had said, "I want to live out the rest of my life with you." It felt like the char underneath his ass had grown nulls, making him uncomfortable and feel odd all over. Ping'an exchanged a few niceties with him, before moving on to the topic proper, saying this servant has ordered his subordinates to be on the lookout for news about the Lapis armor my lord has come to ask about. They've found some things these past few days. Does my lord know that a man called Shen Zhen appeared at Dongting with a Shaolin reverend yesterday, and brought a piece of Lapis armor with him? Zhou Zishu was stunned. Shen Zhen, the head of the Shen clan in Shuzhong? Ping'an nodded. Yes. This person has stayed away from worldly affairs for a long time. To appear so suddenly now, he must have heard of the Zhang family tragedy, and could wait no longer. Zhou Zishu's mind whirled instantaneously, and he reacted immediately, saying, "Oh yes, back then, the La clan of Taixing didn't have an heir and only had those useless little disciples, who were all handed over to Taishan sect leader Hua Fangling, counting the Zhang family in. Could it be that the legendary 5 pieces AF the Lapin armor is indeed in the hands of the 5 major clans in the past?" Ping'an said, "Master Zhou can truly infer 10 things from one single piece of news." Once Shen Zhen showed up, Gao Cheng also acknowledged the presence of a piece of lapis armor at the Gone family manor, and finally revealed the story behind this object. "Have you heard of the Yin Yang Manual, Tangshan Sword Technique, and the 6 Harmonies Cultivation Mantra?" Zhou Zishu frowned slightly and nodded. "I've only heard little about the Yin Yang Manual. I'm not certain of whether it truly exists or not, but it is said to be a sacred relic of the Healer's Valley, able to revive the dead and grow flesh from white bone. Claimed to heal any ailment. Fengshan sword technique was created by Rong Xuan, the peerless expert who turned to the demonic path 30 years ago. The lower scroll is a sword technique instruction, while the theory inscribed in the upper scroll was what he had inferred and adapted from the 6 Harmonies Cultivation Mantra passed down since ancient times. The 6 Harmonies Cultivation Mantra has many parts missing. It's obscure and complex, difficult to understand, and one can very easily undergo chi deviation when practicing it. Regardless, its power is unparalleled, with not one competitor in this world that can surpass it. Does Gao Chong mean that the secret of the lapis armor in the 2 classic manuals that Rong Xuan had left behind? The secret of the lapis armor is the 2 classic manuals that Rong Xuan had left behind. Ping'an nodded. Indeed. According to Hero Gao, Rong Zuan experienced a chi deviation due to the grief of losing his wife, but it was due to his improper technique that his demonic nature burgeoned afterwards. After Rong Xuan died, the few of them found the lapis armor, and saw that the 2 great marvelous techniques and the Healer Valley Yin Yang Manual were contained in it. But any kung fu practitioner could not possibly withstand the life-ruining temptation of either. They felt that this object was too dangerous, and so smashed the lapis armor into pieces, and agreed that each of the 5 clans would keep a fragment to prevent these demonic techniques from reappearing on the Jianghu. Zhou Zishu frowned upon hearing this. Half a beat later, he slowly nodded, and said, "That's what Gao Chong said as well." Ping'an said with an apologetic expression, "This servant's abilities are truly limited." Zhou Zishu shook his head, smiling, and said, "Not even Tian Chuang and 4 Seasons Manor can know all the details of the true happenings of the tragedy 30 years ago, much less you a businessman. You've already been a great help, although, speaking of which, if the 5 major clans each holds a fragment of the lapis armor. Where is the Zhao clans? Did Zhao Jing give an explanation for this?" Ping'an nodded. The head of the Zhao clan claimed that the Zhao clan's lapis armor had been stolen, and its current whereabouts unknown. Once this news was declared, the crowd almost rioted. The Hua Shan sect leader seemed to have concrete evidence and claimed that Zhao Jing usurped the Zhang family's lapis armor. The man that this servant sent there yesterday said that the Huashan sect leader and hero Zhao nearly came to blows. Zhou Ju thought of the piece of lapis armor that he had seen in the underground cave that day. It was most likely the missing piece the Zhao clan had lost, and the thief was undoubtedly either one of the 2 who had died that night, Yu Tianji or Mu Yunj. Unfortunately, like a mantis stalking the cicada unaware of the oriole behind a little ghost from the Ghost Valley had taken advantage, and afterwards, the piece of lapis armor had ended up in Wen Kai Sing hand by happenstance. Then it had been stolen by Fang Buzi, but now he was dead, suspected to have died by the hand of the delighted morning ghost. Zhou Zishu felt uncomfortable, like a rock had been placed on his heart, bile surging. He thought, could this matter be any more complex? Troubled, he bade Ping'an farewell, and returned to look for Zhang Chengling. Zhou Zishu did not completely trust what Gao Chong had said in the past. He had to handle massive amounts of information, and those presented to the emperor had to be the absolute truth ridden of falsehoods. To examine a piece of information, he usually had to verify in detail the causes and consequences of it, until there were entirely no faults in the information, before he dared present it. This was why he was used to doubting anything that he heard while semi-believing it, ready to override any previous information that he knew at any moment. Entering the tavern, he raised his head and immediately glimpsed Wen Kai Sing and Zhang Chengling with Cao Wei Ning and Gu Xiang, and wondered how these 4 people had managed to convene with one another. Soon afterwards, he noticed that Zhang Chengling and Wen Kai Sing were occupying a corner of the table each with Zhang Chengling and Wen Kai Sing were occupying a corner of the table each with exceptionally grave expressions. Unclear on why so, he walked upstairs about to greet them, right as he heard Cao whining in his opinions. What I'm actually most concerned about is the arson in the backyard or a righteous, orthodox clan. Everyone's damaging friendly ties for this Lapis armor. Have they not heard of the tale of 2 Lees killing 3 warriors? Only fear that a catastrophe befalls the pugilist world because of this, and until then, it'll be a stream of corpses. Very foolishly and naively, Gu Xiang asked, stream of what? Cao Weining prattled on patiently. By the riverside, Elle exclaimed, the corpses flow like a river. It describes how the elderly Li felt as if his spirit had visited the riverside one night in a dream, and looked down to see the dead towing downstream the running water. Extremely melancholic, he was inspired. Eyes wide, Gu Xiang exclaimed, Master, Cao de Ge knows so much, he even drops literary references. Zhou Zishu immediately understood why Zhang Chengling's and Wen Keising's expressions were so solemn. Assuming indifference, he turned on his foot, and headed outside. But he was spotted by the sharp-eyed, loose-lipped Wen Keising, a person who had to bring others down into the muck with him regardless, who immediately yelled with fervor, "Hey Shu, why are you walking out? We've been waiting for you for so long, come over quickly." Zhou Zishu thought, this Jinx Valley master when really embodied 8 bloody lifetimes worth of iniquity. Wen Keising happily pulled a chair out, told Zhou Zishu to sit down, and personally poured wine for him, eagerly attentive as he said, "Quick, taste this tavern's good wine, the taste is traditional, it's not bad." Expressionless, Zhou Zishu attempted to use his gaze to convey his evaluation of him. Wen Keising looked at him for half a beat, then all of a sudden, said in a coy voice, "We're still in public." Seeing this, Gu Xing covered Zhang Chengling's eyes with a hand and said, with a grimace, "Even a dog's eyes will be blinded." With a red face, Cao Weining stammered, Miss Gu, actually, you don't have to envy Master Zhao and Master Wen's deep love, you're as beautiful as a flower, there must be someone who secretly admires you." Gu Xiang blinked her wide, innocent eyes at him, asking, "Ah? Really? Where?" Cao Weining stared at her in a daze. Half a beat later, he asked in a non sequitur, "Miss Gu, can I call you A Xiang too?" Zhou Zishu lowered his head to drink his wine in great concentration, reminding himself that it was impolite to have seen or heard anything it was as agonizing as sitting on a carpet of nails, disgusting him until even his tongue was numb. It was the first time in his life where failed to taste what was in his cup. But at this moment, a person walked in through the door. Upon laying eyes on this person, the raucous tavern quietened down in an instant. This was a woman, who walked in with her gaze fixed on something in particular. Noticing the waiter carrying plates staring at her, completely floored, she smiled slightly, and the plates in the Walter's hands fell and shattered on the floor. She was truly too beautiful in that instant. Most of the people who laid eyes on her came to the unanimous decision that she was the most beautiful woman that they had seen in their lives. Even Gu Xiang was agape for a moment, before she tugged at Cao Weining's sleeve, whispering, "Look at her, she isn't a goddess, is she?" Yet, Cao Weining only glanced once in the direction Gu Xiang was looking in and rescinded his attention, whispering, "This woman's gaze strays and drifts. The books on physiognomy call this an intoxicating gaze. She absolutely has no good intentions, and cannot compare with." His last few words were mumbled very softly, so softly that Gu Xiang, who was staring transfixed at the beauty, did not notice. But a chuckle escaped Wen Keising, who mused that Cao Weining was not a quick person himself, and no wonder was averse to others whose gazes strayed quickly. Even the one he had set his heart on was Gu Xiang, who was always in a daze. That beauty swept her gaze around the place once, then came upstairs, heading in the direction. She didn't look at anyone else, her gaze locked solely on Zhou Zishu, as if her pair of amorous eyes had only space for him. She sauntered user to stand beside him and bent to say with a flowery breath, "Could I ask you to buy me a drink?" This was Lady Luck fallen from the heavens. Anyone would have been disoriented upon impact. But without even waiting for Zhou Zishu to speak, a third wheeling hand shot out from one side and planted itself between them like a barricade. Wen Keising stuck his hand into Zhou Zishu robes, fished his coin pouch out in the blink of an eye, and boldly shoved it into his own robes, then said calmly, "Miss, I'm afraid not." Chapter 35. Green Vixen. Zhou Zishu looked up to scrutinize the beautiful woman. When he spoke, his expression was as gentle as his voice was soft. "Do I know you, my lady?" The woman chuckled. "Would it prevent you from buying me a drink if you don't?" Zhou Zishu smiled. "Of course not. Never mind a drink, as charming as the lady is, I'd be willing to let her feast on my flesh and blood if she only asked. Lad, a jug of your best wine." He shot a glance at the cross looking Wen Kai-sing before pointing at him and adding, on his tab. Gu Xiang was witnessing for the first time ever so many brilliant colors bloom on her master's face. She concluded that coming to the meal was truly worth it. Meanwhile, the beautiful woman laughed, her body jostling like a flowery branch swayed by the wind and her titter sounding like silver pearls being spilt into a jade basin. Mystic Melody Chin Song's tunes were nothing compared to that laugh. The wine was brought in shortly and Zhou Zishu said, "Miss, please have a seat." Slender fingers that were as soft as a flower's stamens came to rest on Zhou Zishu's shoulder. "Thanks, but I'll pass. I'll be on my way after this cup." Zhou Zishu emitted an "oh" of disappointment, whereas Wen Kai-sing huffed. "That's just as well," he said in an icy tone. The table was getting cramped. The woman merely threw Wen Kai-sing a glance before she lifted the cup and drained it in. One gulp. Even the way she drank was uncommonly pretty. In fact, her every movement was a delight to the eyes, and Zhou Zishu's pupils were glued to her as if he were reluctant to miss a second of the sight. When she put down the empty cup, she reached out to brush her finger against the side of Zhou Zishu's face. "I'll be off now," she said. "Will you come with me?" Zhou Zishu got up and left without glancing back. A crack resounded in the air as the chopsticks in Wen Kai-sing's hand snapped in two. Gu Xiang and Zhang Chengling ducked their heads in unison, pretending they hadn't seen. Cao Wei-ning's face, however, filled with righteous indignation. He pointed in the direction the depraved couple had left. Brother Wen has been steadfast toward him since the beginning, he fumed. Yet brother CH.30. Zhou is putting putting gals before pals? But that wasn't right, was it? He bit his tongue. Wen Kai-sing turned toward Cao Wei-ning then. The foolish lad had never been more agreeable to his eyes before. Seeking to be consoled, he gazed at him with a face that seemed on the verge of tears, making it Gu Xiang's turn to bite on her tongue. But then, Cao Wei-ning gave it some thought and addressed Wen Kai-sing in a solemn tone. "That is to say, now that I'm thinking of it, the matter may be more complex than it seems. Gee, brother Wen, I've talked out of turn. Please don't take anything I've said to heart. Brother Zhou isn't like that. I'm sure he has some secret difficulties he can't talk about that made him resort to such despicable measures. You should by no means misunderstand him." Gu Xiang hurried to agree. "That's right, master. You really shouldn't misunderstand him. Didn't you see that even the heels of Zhou Shu's shoes were pointing toward you when he left? A definitive sign of how much he hated to go." That time, even Cao Wei-ning caught the sarcasm in Gu Xiang's words. He was, however, too embarrassed to say anything, and only stared at her helplessly. Zhang Chengling intervened. "Sister Gu Xiang, please stop talking." But silence wasn't consolation enough, and Wen Kai-sing abruptly stood up to storm off after Zhou Zishu. The three remaining people were left to stare at each other in the face. Gu Xiang swallowed. "Well, master's in a real snit," she said in a small voice. Cao Wei-ning shook his head and sighed. As the poem goes, after a night of wind and bears, how many are the fallen tears? Since ancient times the word love has been the one that hurts the most. But then, what can we do? Zhang Chengling reflected that there was nothing he could add after that. Thus, he bent his head to his food to eat in silence. The beautiful woman led Zhou Zishu to a narrow alley. She took many twists and turns before entering a small courtyard in which grew several plum trees that were yet to bloom. As she pushed open a room door, a muted fragrance drifted to Zhou Zishu's nostrils. The woman raised the beaded curtain screening the entrance, leaned her body against the doorframe, and smiled coyly. "What is it? Aren't you coming in?" Zhou Zishu followed her gaze and cast a glance inside. He could make out the dim outlines of a silk screen and an ornate bed, with a vanity table standing in the corner. A long woman's skirt hung beside a bronze mirror, and a box of rouge lay open next to a makeup chest whose contents were spilled about in disarray. The sight seemed straight from the fabled land of tenderness. Zhou Zishu shook his head. "A foul man like me daren't enter a lady's boudoir so casually." The woman was all smiles. "A bit too late to be a gentleman, don't you think? Won't you come in even if I insist?" Zhou Zishu let out a chuckle and lowered his head to gaze at the point of his shoe. "My deepest apologies to the lady. But even if I had courage to spare, I still wouldn't dare trespass on a chamber in which the Rouge's tomb incense burns. I'm rather afraid it's the kind of room that'd be entered standing, but left reclining. On a stretcher headed for the morgue." At that, the grin on the woman's face stiffened for a second. But she recovered quick enough. are you really going to be useless now that you're already here? Don't you men always say a death gleaned from under the peony flower, as a ghost still the fragrance savor? Some men may say so, but I'd rather live if it's an option, Joe's issue replied. After all, a few more days spent alive is a few more occasions to pass under the peonies, don't you agree? Besides, the kind of charm that would make a woman such as you pick me, and only me, in a crowd of 1,000 isn't something I can pretend to possess. Of that, I'm self-aware enough to be certain, and my lady has been only too flattering. I think it's better that we cut to the chase. How about you just tell me what it is you want? Once it's out in the open, who knows? Whether we may simply talk it out. The woman eyed him for a moment before letting out an affected sigh. Who else would I have picked up if not you? In that little gang of yours, it was either a foolish girl or an immature kid. Or a foolish lad wholly devoted to the foolish girl. And then, there was that last one. She paused before carrying on. The weirdo who had only eyes for you, a foul man, and didn't once look at me. Say, how strange was he? TSK, I did look, you see, but you were the only normal man around. So, tell me, who else could I have picked? Joe's issue coughed to clear his throat, regretting having brought up the subject at all. He was yet more blunt when he spoke again. Miss, if you're after the Lapis armor, we may part ways now. I don't have the Zhang's fragment. Though I did hear that Sir Gao and Sir Shen handed over one each just yesterday. If you're interested, you might want to pay them a visit instead. The woman narrowed her eyes at that. She dropped the beaded curtain at the same time she let go of the facade. Regardless of who has them, all the Lapis armor fragments will be mine eventually, she said in a quiet voice. You say you don't have one, but why should I believe you? Aren't all men fond of telling lies? Joe's issue leant against a plum tree and neither agreed nor denied. For a while, he simply eyed the woman with a serene expression on his face. Then, he exhaled a sudden, heartfelt sigh. Miss. Amongst the numerous women I've laid my eyes upon, your manners alone are enough to distinguish you, you know? The words he spoke were kind, yet, for some unknown reason, the smile faded from the woman's face. She even seemed to be losing her cool as she said in a shrill voice, what did you just say? Joe's issue shook his head. I'm only pointing out that my lady is already beautiful. Even if her looks were ordinary, her other charms would be hard to conceal. Why obsess over mere physical appearance and fall into the entrapments of mediocrity? A friend of mine once said that a person's features are given by the heavens, one looks as one should, and any alteration upon them is bound to be fraught with flaws for others to spot. I can see that my lady's craftsmanship is consummate, yet doesn't she understand that simple logic? The woman's face grew cold. Why did you follow me here, then? Was it only to humiliate me? Joe's issue shook his head again and replied in a voice that was yet more gentle. Not at all. I had no such intentions. Disguises may be hard to detect for laymen, but not for an expert like Joe's issue, who was moreover used to observing people. The woman was beautiful, but he knew at first glance that she wasn't all that young. Yet the complexion of her face, neck and hands looked natural, so well applied, in fact, that it seemed real. Only one technique could have achieved that degree of perfection, the Four Seasons estate's ancestral know-how. He wondered where she could have learned it. The woman's laugh was bleak when she said, all right, I'll let you see it then. With that, she retrieved from her breast a handkerchief and a small bottle, poured a liquid from the bottle onto the fabric, before proceeding to wipe her face with it. With each of her swiping motions, her exquisite visage that seemed to come straight from a painting melted away. Her complexion dulled whilst the shape of her features changed. Then, from the side of her face, she peeled off a mask that was as thin and diaphanous as a cicada's wings. Almost invisible, it could have been the painted skin of legend. Joe's issue held his breath. She wasn't ugly. Although they didn't compare to her made-up stunning allure, the woman's original features still qualified her as beautiful. That is to say, if the left side of her face hadn't been marred by an uneven and sinister burn scar. He knew who she was. You're the Green Vixen, Luquine Cow, aren't you? The Green Vixen was no good news. She was a virtuoso seducer who was rumored to carry innumerable masks on her person at any given moment. Like a succubus, she loved nothing better than to entice young men to her bed and kill them by inhaling their internal energy. Although she had committed countless murders, she continued to elude capture because of her proficiency at disguises. Luquine Cow's smile was like ice when she said, do you understand now why I must obtain the Lapis armor? Joe's issue was silent for a moment, before he answered quietly, You're not after the method of the Seal Hill sword. What you want is the yin-yang manual. She may have been a master of disguises, but Lu Qiancao's true face was one that could never see the light of day. For a woman to be vain about her appearance was a matter of course, and even an average girl was liable to commit appalling acts in the name of beauty. The same principle could only hold truer for someone like her. With the added twist that if a person proficient in the art of disguises failed to guard their heart and became obsessed with their appearance, they would fall prey to their own skills and lose themselves in the thousands of masks available to them. To the point they'd forget their own name and what they had originally looked like, in a manner that the insane wouldn't envy. Zhou Zishu shook his head. I'm telling you the truth. None of us has the Zhang's armor fragments. The cold smile was still etched on Lu Qiancao's lips when, without ado, she pulled out a dagger and thrust it at Zhou Zishu. Zhou Zishu dodged the blade by twisting to the side, and reached out with clawed fingers to catch her arm. He did not anticipate, however, the spikes that sprang around her wrist. The prickles that resembled the ones on a hedgehog's back glinted with a bluish glow as a thick mist gushed from her sleeve. Zhou Zishu hastily released his grip and retreated 3 successive steps whilst holding his breath, only to see Lu Qiancao's silhouette flash in front of him. She was gone in a blink, leaving the words, "You just wait," ringing in the air. Zhou Zishu sighed. He was suddenly overcome with worries about the path ahead. The Green Temptress had been dealt with for today, but who knew who would come tomorrow? It appeared that there was no worse trouble magnet on earth than Zhang Chengling. No wonder that Gao Chong and Zhao Jing, the sly old foxes, had been so content to let him take away the little nuisance. Turning around to leave, he had just pushed open the courtyard's gate when, in a motion as fast as lightning, a hand shot out to his side, aiming for his shoulder. Out of reflex, Zhou Zishu tucked in his arm to duck the incoming attack whilst retaliating with a chopping strike. The person took the hit full on and let out a low groan. Yet, they didn't relent, to the contrary, they launched their whole body at him whilst crying out, "Merit aside." Zhou Zishu kicked the guy aside and crossed both arms in front of his chest. "Valley Master Wen, did you forget to take your medicine again?" he asked with a frown. Wen Keising grimaced in pain while holding onto his ribs as if they were about to shatter. Yet, his tone was full of energetic acrimony as he said, "You left with a woman right in front of me. And you followed her to this sordid place to have a tryst. A bachelor and a single woman getting together in broad daylight. Why, shouldn't you be off to one of your brothel rendezvous by now?" Zhou Zishu blurted out. As soon as he heard the words that had come out of his mouth, Zhou Zishu almost swallowed his tongue in regret. He reflected that anger must have muddled his brain to pronounce such a line. For his part, Wen Keising gave a start before a grin broke onto his face. Unabashed, he pressed in closer and said, "I haven't touched anyone else since I decided to chase after you, you know." Zhou Zishu's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My deepest gratitude for the Valley Master's tender regards, but I haven't decided to chase after him." At that, Wen Keising actually pondered for a moment. "That's true," he replied, seemingly finding Zhou Zishu's statement reasonable. "But then, if you may have as many trysts as you please, I may also follow and hide in corners to listen in on you as I wish."